Okay, let's start. Number 1. Azazel. You're in Jerusalem in 70 BCE, standing in the outer court of the Second Temple during Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. The high priest holds 2 goats. He draws lots, one for God, one for Azazel. The goat chosen for Azazel is not sacrificed. It is sent alive into the wilderness, loaded with the sins of the entire nation, and driven off a cliff east of the city. The ceremony happens every year. The priests know the name. Nobody asks who Azazel is. Leviticus 16 still carries his name in verses 8, 10, and 26:1 of only a handful of non-divine named beings in the entire Torah. The King James Version translates the term as scapegoat in several editions, obscuring the personal name entirely. But the Hebrew is unambiguous. The name is Azazel. The church left that name in the text and stripped everything around it. Here is what Leviticus does not tell you. The Book of Enoch, specifically 1 Enoch chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, records Azazel's full dossier. He taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. He taught them to smelt iron and produce weapons at scale. He taught women to use antimony, the mineral ground into black powder for eye paint, and showed them how to deploy ornaments of silver, dye, and cosmetic adornment as instruments of seduction and social control. Two-front corruption. Men's capacity for destruction and women's capacity for influence, targeted at the same moment. He did not operate alone. Samyaza commanded the overall descent, but Azazel ran the weapons and influence program. He was the operational layer between commanding angel and human population. An angel with a command structure, a documented assignment, and measurable outputs is not a theological abstraction. He is an entity that requires accounting for. And accounting for him requires accounting for who deleted the record. The Dead Sea Scrolls Fragment 4Q203, part of the Book of Giants from Qumran Cave 4, contains additional Azazel material recovered between 1947 and 1956. Researcher Lauren Stuckenbruck of Ludwig Maximilian University, analyzing these fragments in his 1997 work, confirmed that the Azazel tradition predates the Christian canon and was treated as authoritative within Second Temple Judaism before the Church made any editorial decisions. This was not marginal literature. It was the standard record. Here is the most significant detail in the entire account. When God issues Azazel's punishment in 1 Enoch chapter 10, verses 4 through 6, the command goes to the archangel Raphael. Bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness. Make an opening in the desert which is in Dudael, and cast him therein. Place upon him rough and jagged rocks, and cover him with darkness. He is under rocks, in a desert with a name, still there. The text states he remains in Dudael until the day of judgment. Between now and then, he is imprisoned in the Judean wilderness under stone, bound hand and foot, while the ceremony bearing his name has been observed for 3,000 years by a tradition that kept the ritual and buried the context. The scapegoat ritual was not symbolic ceremony. 1 goat for God, 1 for Azazel. The annual ceremony was a structured transaction, a ritualized payment to an entity, who received it every year from a nation that maintained the practice for centuries. When the Second Temple fell in 70 CE, the ceremony stopped, but Leviticus 16 kept the name, and more than 14 million people still observe Yom Kippur every year in ceremonies traceable to that ritual. Azazel is in the liturgy. His file is not. The Church's problem with Azazel is not that he represents evil. The canonical texts preserve Lucifer, Satan, and Belial without removing them. The problem is that Azazel is operational. He runs a program. He has a chain of command. He responds to annual negotiation. He has a specific address in a specific desert. That level of specificity belongs to documented historical operations, not moral abstractions. The Church could not reduce him to metaphor without removing the text that prevented it. They removed the text. They forgot verse 8. Who approved the weapons and influence program Azazel ran beneath Samyaza's command? Why does the Day of Atonement, still observed by millions annually, involve sending a goat into the wilderness for a being the Church classified as unmentionable? What is under the rocks in Dudael? And if his name survived in Leviticus by oversight, what else did the Church fail to fully remove? His name is still there. Verse 8. Open any Bible. Azazel is still in the Bible. Gadriel is not. And what Gadriel did rewrite Genesis from the first page. Number 2. Gadriel. You're in Caesarea in 325 CE, 6 months before the Council of Nicaea opens. Eusebius of Caesarea, who will serve as Constantine's theological architect for the council, is reviewing documents. He has read the Book of Enoch. He has read chapter 69, verse 6. He understands exactly what it says. He does not recommend it for inclusion in the canon. There is no surviving record that he explained why. The Book of Enoch, chapter 69, verse 6, in the R.H. Charles translation corroborated by Aramaic fragments from Qumran. The name of the fourth is Gadriel. He it is who showed the children of men all the blows of death, and he led astray Eve, not Satan, not Lucifer, not the adversary. Gadriel, a specific name, a specific function, a specific victim. The name Gadriel means, in the Semitic root structure, God is my helper. The angel who led Eve astray carried a name declaring divine endorsement. This records how the being presented itself in the garden, claiming to operate with God's authorization, and using that claimed authority against what it claimed to represent. The entity that entered the garden declared itself a divine instrument and acted accordingly. Here is what removing Gadriel required the church to build in his place. Satan's role as Eden's tempter is not stated in Genesis. Genesis chapter 3 describes a serpent. It does not identify the serpent as a fallen angel, as Lucifer, or as the adversary of Job. The identification of the Genesis serpent with Lucifer or Satan developed across centuries of theological construction. Begun by Origen in the 3rd century, formalized by Augustine in the 4th, universalized through the medieval period. That entire theological architecture connecting the serpent to Satan, Satan to the fall to the need for atonement, atonement to Christ's death, was built to fill the space that opened when Gadriel's name was removed from the record. The structure exists to cover the gap. The gap was deliberate. The Book of Enoch was not fringe material when these decisions were made. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered at Qumran beginning in 1947, included 7 separate manuscript copies of 1st Enoch, more copies than were found for most books now in the Hebrew Bible. 7 copies signals a community actively reading, copying, preserving, and treating this text as essential. It named Gadriel. It was authoritative before Christianity existed as an institution. The Synod of Laodicea in 363 CE formally excluded the Book of Enoch from the Christian Old Testament. The Councils of Hippo in 393 CEA and Carthage in 397 CE confirmed the exclusion and established the canonical boundaries Western Christianity has used ever since. The exclusion was an active decision made across multiple documented sessions by named bishops with recorded outcomes. Someone at those tables had read 1 Enoch chapter 69, verse 6. The text was excluded anyway. One tradition did not follow this decision. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church maintains the Book of Enoch as full canonical scripture to this day. Their Bible contains Gadriel's name. It has since the 4th century CE. The Ethiopian Church retained it deliberately as authoritative scripture for 16 unbroken centuries. The Church succeeded in burying Gadriel in the West. In Ethiopia, Gadriel has always been in the text. The doctrinal consequence of this is not minor. If Gadriel deceived Eve, then Lucifer did not. If Lucifer did not deceive Eve, the theological structure connecting Lucifer's fall, his entry into the garden, and his role as the ongoing adversary of humanity requires rebuilding at the foundation. The atonement theology positioning Christ's death as reversing the original sin introduced by Satan requires a different author for the original sin. Every creed, catechism, and systematic theology that begins its narrative with Satan tempted Eve begins with an event that the oldest available source material found in 7 copies at Qumran assigns to a different being entirely. The Satan narrative is not a translation. It is a replacement built over a removed name. If Gadriel led Eve astray, who granted him access to the garden? Why does the oldest and most extensively preserved pre-Christian Jewish text assign Eden's deception to a specific named watcher angel that centuries of Christian theology replaced with a different entity? Why did the Ethiopian Orthodox Church retain this information unbroken across 16 centuries while Western canonical councils suppressed it? And what does the theological architecture of Western Christianity look like when examined against the source material those councils chose to exclude? Gadriel's name does not appear in any Bible sold in any Western bookstore. The Ethiopian one has had it since the 4th century. The church buried Gadriel because he exposes what really happened in the garden. Samyaza was buried for a different reason. What he organized was not a single act of deception. It was a coordinated invasion. Number 3. Samyaza. You're on the summit of Mount Hermon, 232 feet above sea level at the northern tip of what is now the border of Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. It is somewhere in the 3rd or 4th millennium BCE. 200 beings have converged here. Not because it was convenient, because this was the location where the boundary between their domain and the terrestrial one was at its thinnest, and they needed that thinness for what they intended to do. The text records that they made a collective oath at this summit. They knew the descent was forbidden. They swore together so none of them could pull back alone. 1 Enoch chapter 6, verses 3 through 8, preserves the record of that oath, and the names of every leader who swore it. Samyaza is named first. Under him, 19 subcommanders, each named: Baraqel, Remiel, Kokabiel, Tamiel, Remiel, Danel, Ezekiel, Baraqel, Asael, Armaros, Gadriel, Ananel, Zachiel, Samsapiel, Turiel, Turiel, Remiel, and Saraqael. 20 leaders. 200 beings total, descending under a named chain of command. This is not a vague angelic rebellion. This is a documented operation with recorded officers, a specific location, and a sworn oath at a geographic site that still exists. Mount Hermon is a real mountain. British archaeologist Sir Charles Warren surveyed the summit in 1869 and documented more than 20 ancient temple ruins on its slopes and plateau, a concentration of sacred structures greater than any comparable elevation in the ancient Near East. Inside one summit temple, Warren found a Greek inscription referencing those who take an oath on that mountain. That inscription is now in the British Museum. The text describing the oath sworn there is not in the canonical Bible. The physical location of the oath is publicly accessible. The document explaining what the oath was about was removed in 363 CEES. The product of the Watcher descent was the Nephilim. Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 names them another the church could not fully excise. There were giants in the earth in those days. The Hebrew root naphil means to fall, to cause to fall, those who fell from above. They were the offspring of the Watchers and human women. 1 Enoch chapter 7 verses 2 through 5 records that they consumed human agricultural output and then consumed human populations. The Dead Sea Scrolls fragment 4Q 531, part of the Book of Giants from Qumran, contains passages in which the Nephilim experience prophetic nightmares about the flood coming to destroy them. That fragment is in the Jordan Archaeological Museum in Amman. Samyaza's punishment, recorded in 1 Enoch chapter 10, verses 11 through 13, and elaborated in the Zohar's commentary on Genesis, is not fire or a lake of sulfur. He is bound and suspended in the sky, hanging in a position where he cannot see his own face. Not buried like Azazel, not chained in underground darkness. Suspended between realms, oriented toward nothing, permanently facing the consequences of what he commanded while being unable to look away. That specific punishment says something precise about the nature of the crime. He was the one who gave the order that committed 200 beings to an action none of them could reverse. His eternity is reckoning without the option to close his eyes. The Church removed the Watcher command structure because a named hierarchy produces a liability that vague theology does not. Vague, fallen angels require no institutional accounting. Named officers with specific assignments and a recorded chain of command create something else entirely. A paper trail. A named commander means there is a record of what was commanded. A record of what was commanded means there is a question of accountability for whoever deleted that record. The Church did not remove Samyaza because he is obscure. They removed him because he is exact. Numbers chapter 13, verse 33. In the canonical Bible still names the Nephilim when Israelite spies return from Canaan and describe giants in the land. That verse sits in the canonical text as an effect without a documented cause, because the material explaining their origin was removed from the sources the canonical Bible draws from. The Church preserved the consequence and buried the record of what produced it. Who authorized Samyaza's operation before the oath was sworn on Mount Hermon? Why are there more ancient temple ruins on that specific summit than on any comparable elevation in the ancient Near East? And why does one of them contain a Greek inscription about oath-taking? What do the 4Q 531 fragments from Qumran contain that academic publication has not yet fully addressed? And why does the canonical record preserve the Nephilim by name and numbers, while removing every document that explains how they came to exist? The mountain is there. The temple is there. The British Museum has the inscription. Samyaza organized the descent. His commanders carried specific assignments. Penemue's assignment was the most quietly catastrophic of all of them. He taught humans to write. Number 4. Penemue. You're in the scriptorium of the Abbey of St. Gall in what is now Switzerland, in 820 CEE. A monk is copying a manuscript by lamplight onto calfskin parchment. He believes he is performing sacred labor, another link in the chain of written transmission by which the Church maintains its authority. He is using a technology that a condemned watcher angel transmitted to the human population. The document that identifies that angel as the source of writing itself was removed from the canon he is copying. He performs his sacred labor with the corrupting gift of an entity the institution around him has erased. 1 Enoch chapter 69, verses 8 through 11. Preserved in the Ethiopic Jez canon and corroborated by Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls fragments from Qumran, describes Penemue's crime with precision that is difficult to misread. Verse 8. He taught humans the bitter and the sweet. Verse 9. He taught them the use of ink and paper. Verse 10. And thereby many sinned from eternity to eternity and until this day. Verse 11. He taught humans to eat with their mouths as the children of earth do, normalizing the full range of embodied human behavior across a population that had not previously had access to it. From eternity to eternity and until this day. This is not incidental language. It is the Enoch text's editorial verdict on its own significance. The author is stating that the introduction of ink and paper produced a corruption that was still ongoing at the time of writing and, by the internal logic of the text, would not stop. Writing enabled false records. Writing enabled institutional authority over information. Writing enabled the production of documents claiming divine origin that could not be independently verified by the populations receiving them. Every mechanism by which human institutions have controlled human populations since the Bronze Age runs through the technology Penemue transmitted. The Church cannot acknowledge Penemue, not because his teaching failed, because it worked perfectly. The Church's institutional existence is built entirely on written documents. The canonical Bible is a written document. Papal authority rests on written papal bulls. The apostolic succession the Church claims traces through written ordination records. The sacraments are defined in written creeds and enforced through written catechisms. The authority of every council from Nicaea to Vatican II derives from written minutes and written decrees. The institution that excluded Penemue's record from the canon uses the technology Penemue, introduced as the foundation of its entire administrative and theological infrastructure. To acknowledge Penemue is to acknowledge that the source of all institutional authority is a condemned angelic transmission. This is not a problem the Church can theologize its way around. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in December 1945 near the cliff of Jabal al-Tarif in Egypt, contains 12 codices of Gnostic texts written in Coptic, translated from earlier Greek originals, dated to approximately 350 CEE. Several of these texts engage directly with the theme of knowledge transmitted from angelic or divine beings to humans, consistently framing that transmission as simultaneously liberating and corrupting. Its theology of angelic knowledge as double-edged gift treated the Watcher tradition seriously. The institutional Church suppressed both the Gnostic tradition and the Enochic source material that fed it. The Jewish Midrashic tradition reaches the opposite conclusion on the same question. The Talmudic tradition generally attributes the Hebrew alphabet and written transmission to divine gift through Moses treating writing as sacred in origin rather than corrupted. Two ancient Semitic traditions occupying the same geographic space, reaching opposite verdicts on who gave humans writing. The Church's exclusion of the Enoch text resolved the contradiction by burying one side without disclosing that the debate had existed. Researcher Gabriel Boccaccini of the University of Michigan, in his 1998 work, Beyond the Essene Hypothesis, documented the Penemue tradition within its full Second Temple context, establishing that the Enochic Jewish tradition that preserved this material was serious pre-Christian scholarship, not peripheral speculation, not marginal sectarianism, authoritative. Its exclusion was a choice made with full awareness of what was being chosen against. The text says, until this day. The day has not ended. If Penemue introduced ink and paper as the specific mechanism by which humanity sinned from eternity to eternity, what does that verdict say about every institutional document written in his medium to manage the populations that trust it? Why did the Church remove the angelic source of the technology that every church document depends on, while using that technology continuously to enforce canonical compliance? What other transmitted capabilities remain in active daily use, stripped of origin, presented as neutral human achievement? And who benefits most from humanity having writing without knowing where writing came from? Penemue gave humans the means to record knowledge. Kokabiel gave humans a specific knowledge that made the Church uncomfortable for a completely different reason. He handed them the stars. Number 5. Kokabiel. You're in Laodicea, in what is now Western Turkey, in 363 CEE. A council of bishops is drafting Canon 36. The language they settle on is precise. It is not lawful for clergymen to be sorcerers, enchanters, mathematici, or astrologers. The Latin mathematici in this context refers to astrologers, those who calculate celestial positions to understand events on earth. In the same session, these bishops are working through the list of texts to exclude from the Christian canon. The Book of Enoch is on that list. The text naming the angel who taught astrology to humanity is being buried in the same room in the same year that astrology is being formally prohibited. Same room, same year, same session. This is not coincidence. This is information management at the institutional level. Kokabiel is listed in 1 Enoch chapter 6 verse 7 as one of Samyaza's 20 chief commanders in the Watcher descent. His name is built from two roots: Kochav, meaning star in Hebrew and Aramaic, and El, meaning God. His name translates as Star of God. The Enoch tradition assigns his teaching function directly from his name. Celestial knowledge, the movement and positional meaning of stars, the reading of stellar configurations as a system carrying information about events on Earth. The institutional problem is layered. If astrology is a harmless human superstition with no real mechanism, the Church could simply call it false and move on. No suppression required. But if a named, organized being with a specific function within a documented command hierarchy taught it as his designated assignment, then astrology is not a human superstition. It is suppressed angelic technology with a traceable chain of transmission. Suppressed angelic technology with a traceable chain of transmission is exactly what an institution, built on controlling divine knowledge, cannot leave in the accessible record. So it removed the record and left the prohibition standing, without an origin. The Babylonian astronomical tradition establishes that Kokabiel's function describes something historically real. The Enuma Anu Enlil, a Babylonian astrological compendium systematically compiled between approximately 1595 and 1157 BCE, records centuries of organized celestial observation and its correlations with earthly events predating the Christian era by more than a millennium, and operating with a sophistication that the canonical texts never acknowledge. Researcher Francesca Rochberg of UC Berkeley, in her 2004 work, The Heavenly Writing, documented the Babylonian celestial science tradition and its transmission into Hellenistic, Jewish, and early Christian intellectual culture. The Dead Sea Scrolls designations 4Q28 and 4Q29, identified by scholars as the Aramaic Astronomical Book of Enoch, constitute the oldest recoverable section of the Enochic textual tradition, predating the Watcher narrative chronologically. This section is a technical astronomical document, systematic in its description of celestial mechanics. The community at Qumran operated simultaneously within the Enochic astronomical tradition and the Watcher narrative tradition. Kokabiel connects them directly. The knowledge system and the being who transmitted it are both preserved in the same body of literature, by the same community, before the Church existed to exclude either. Annette Yoshiko Red of New York University, in her 2005 scholarly work Fallen Angels and the History of Judaism and Christianity, documented that the communities preserving these texts understood the Watcher functions, including Kokabiel's celestial assignment, as descriptions of historical events. Not allegory, not poetic myth, not doctrinal metaphor. Records. The Roman Catholic Church continues to officially prohibit astrology in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 2016. All forms of divination are to be rejected. Consulting horoscopes, astrology, palm reading, conceal a desire for power over time, history, and, in the last analysis, other human beings. The prohibition has been continuous since 363 CE. The text naming astrology's angelic source has been excluded from the Western canon for the same unbroken duration. Both decisions were made in the same session. Both have been maintained in tandem ever since. The Roman Inquisition burned Giordano Bruno in 16 CE, in part for his advocacy of celestial mysticism. Johannes Kepler, whose mathematical laws of planetary motion are the foundation of modern orbital mechanics, faced near prosecution for astrological practice in 1615 CEE. The institution spent 12 centuries of active enforcement on the Laodicean prohibition, while keeping the document that names its origin buried in its exclusion. Why did the Council of Laodicea ban astrology and exclude the text naming astrology's angelic teacher in the same session? If astrology is harmless human error, why did an institution require 12 centuries of active enforcement to contain it? What does the Enochic celestial tradition carry that required this sustained response, spanning a burning in 16 CE and a catechism prohibition, maintained to the present day? And why does Kokabiel's name appear in a document found in 7 copies at Qumran, treated as authoritative before Christianity formed its prohibition against what he taught? Kokabiel handed humans the sky. Armaros gave them something more dangerous. He gave them the tools to undo what heaven had put in place. Number 6. Armaros. You're reading 1 Enoch chapter 8 verse 3. The text is in Jez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia, preserved in manuscripts held in the British Library, the Bodleian at Oxford, and in monasteries on the shores of Lake Tana in the Ethiopian highlands. R.H. Charles rendered it in 1906 from the Ethiopic manuscript tradition. 4 words describe Armaros's entire function: the resolving of enchantments. The Church needed 4 centuries of successive council decisions to successfully bury the document containing them from the Western canonical record. In the Ethiopian highlands, those 4 centuries made no difference. The text stayed. Armaros stayed with it. Armaros is listed in 1 Enoch chapter 8 verse 3 as the 4th named teaching function among the Watchers. His domain, the resolving of enchantments, requires cultural context to carry its full weight. In the ancient Near Eastern worldview, an enchantment is not theatrical decoration or carnival magic. Enchantments are structural. They are the operational mechanisms by which divine authority asserts itself in physical reality, the binding forces that enforce the boundary between what a specific divine power has claimed as its territory and what remains outside that claim. An enchantment marks jurisdictional possession. To resolve one to dissolve it, undo it, release its jurisdictional claim is to remove the active mechanism of divine authority from a space, a person, or a situation. Armaros taught humans how to do this independently. He gave the human population the procedural knowledge to withdraw divine jurisdictional claims without institutional mediation. The consequence for the Church's authority is structural and unavoidable. The sacramental economy the Church administers is built on the premise that divine protective structures require institutional channels to access and maintain. Baptism places a person under divine protection through a sacrament the Church administers. The Eucharist maintains and renews that protection. Confession restores it when sin breaks it. The entire architecture of sacramental grace rests on humans requiring an institutional intermediary to engage with divine protective coverage. Armaros taught humans to engage with those structures independently, without the intermediary, without institutional permission. If that knowledge exists and is accessible, sacramental mediation becomes optional. An institution whose authority rests entirely on being the exclusive channel for divine protection cannot survive optional as a category. The Church cannot allow optional, so the Church buried the text that introduced it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which preserved the Book of Enoch and Armaros' record within it, maintains a directly connected parallel tradition. The Kitab, small leather pouches containing written biblical verses, prayers, and sacred formulas, worn on the body as protective amulets, is an active element of Ethiopian Christian religious life. This practice is not peripheral, lay custom disconnected from the institution. It is practiced by Ethiopian Orthodox clergy. The same institution that preserved the text, naming an angel whose function was transmitting protective, structure knowledge, also preserves the active practice of written protective amulets as legitimate religious protection. These are not coincidentally related. The institution that never excluded Armaros never stopped doing what Armaros described. Researcher Lauren Stuckenbruck of Ludwig Maximilian University, in his 1997 work on the Book of Giants from Qumran, noted the precision with which Watcher functions are assigned. Armaros' domain is the protective mechanism itself, the structural interface between divine authority and the human beings that authority operates over. The canonical New Testament preserves the concept of spiritual warfare without the independent technology that Armaros represents. Ephesians chapter 6 verse 12 describes the principalities and powers that believers contend against. The armor described in Ephesians 6, the shield of faith, the sword of the Spirit. The belt of truth is exclusively mediated through institutional faith, institutional scripture, institutional doctrine. The canonical text preserves the battle. It removes the independent capability. Armaros represents the capacity to engage that battle outside institutional channels, which is exactly why his record was buried while the battle remained in the text. The Church preserved the problem. They removed the independent solution. That is not theology. That is institutional design. What is the specific procedural knowledge that constitutes the resolving of enchantments, and what is the mechanism by which it works? Why does the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which retained Armaros' name in canonical texts, also retain the Kitab protective amulet tradition as standard clergy practice, connecting text and function across 16 centuries? And why does the New Testament preserve the concept of spiritual warfare while removing every document that describes independent human capacity to engage it? 4 words. Resolving of enchantments. 4 centuries of councils to bury them. Armaros taught the breaking of divine protection. Saraqael's role was different. He did not work on protections. He worked on what happened to human souls when the protection failed. Number 7. Saraqael. You're in Alexandria in 203 CE. Origen of Alexandria, the most intellectually serious biblical scholar the early church produced, is writing commentaries that engage directly with the named angelic hierarchy, treating the beings recorded in texts like the Book of Enoch as occupants of a real cosmological structure. He believes these texts are authoritative. He engages with them as such. Within 2 centuries, the church will exclude the texts he engaged with. Within 3.5 centuries, at the Second Council of Constantinople, in 553 CE, the church will declare Origen himself a heretic. His body of work will be substantially destroyed. And the angel he engaged with Saraqael will disappear from Western canonical texts as completely as if he had never been recorded. 1 Enoch chapter 20, verses 1 through 7, lists 6 archangels with their specific administrative domains. Verse 6 names Saraqael with a precision that has no parallel in canonical archangel tradition. He is set over the spirits of the children of men who sin in the spirit. That phrase is a judicial appointment with a specific portfolio, not over all souls, not over all sinners, over the category defined as those who sin in the spirit as distinguished from those who sin in the flesh, which the list assigns elsewhere. This is a classification system, a celestial court with differentiated judicial functions and named administrators for each. The canonical Christian afterlife has one judgment seat. Romans chapter 14 verse 10. We shall all stand before the judgment seat of God. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 10. We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, a single arbiter, a single judgment, and a single institution positioned to mediate access to that arbiter's mercy through sacraments, through confession, through absolution, through last rites. The entire architecture of the Church's authority over the afterlife depends on the singularity of that judgment. Saraqael breaks the singularity. A differentiated celestial court, with named judges administering specific categories, means multiple jurisdictions operating simultaneously. Multiple jurisdictions mean no single institution can claim to cover all of them. You cannot hold the keys to a building that already has staff. Matthew chapter 16 verse 19, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, is a claim to manage the single point of access. Saraqael makes the access point not single. The keys metaphor only works if there is one door. A differentiated celestial court has multiple doors, each administered by a different angel with a prior divine appointment. The Church cannot hold all those keys because it cannot appoint or replace the administrators already holding them. Origen's De Principii, written around 220 CE, develops a systematic cosmological framework treating named angelic administrators as occupants of real functional roles. The Origenist controversies occupied 3 separate theological councils across 400 years. The Second Council of Constantinople in 553 CE condemned 15 specific Origenist propositions. Proposition 9 targeted the hierarchy of angelic beings. When the council condemned Origen, it sealed off an entire mode of theological engagement with named angelic structure, ensuring no future theologian could treat these administrators seriously without facing the same classification. Saraqael's name survived in the oldest traditions. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church lists him among the 7 archangels venerated in liturgical practice. The Coptic Orthodox Church of Egypt preserves variant forms of this name, Turiel in its archangel tradition. Both predate the Western canonical councils. Both kept the record. What disappeared from the West is intact in both of the oldest surviving Christian institutions. The medieval Church's authority over the afterlife was the foundation of its most consequential temporal power. Masses said for the dead. The apparatus of intercessory theology as a service with associated costs. All of it depends on undefined spiritual real estate and afterlife whose administration is vague enough to allow institutional claim. Named angelic administrators with specific jurisdictions over specific categories of souls are an existing bureaucracy with prior divine appointment. You cannot charge entry fees to a space that already has a divinely appointed administrator who reports to no earthly institution, who established the classification system that divides souls by category and assigns them to different angelic jurisdictions. Why did the Second Council of Constantinople in 553 CE specifically condemn theological engagement with angelic hierarchy, moving against Origen 3 centuries after his death, rather than letting his influence fade? What happens to souls in Saraqael's specific jurisdiction in the period between death and final judgment? And if the oldest continuous Christian institutions in Ethiopia and Egypt preserved named angelic administrators in liturgical tradition without suppression, why did the Western Church require the complete removal of the same names? Origen is condemned. Saraqael is gone from the West. The Ethiopian liturgy still names him weekly. Saraqael judges souls. Baraqel worked above that level entirely. He did not judge what happened to human souls. He controlled what happened to the sky above their heads. Number 8. Baraqel. You're watching a thunderstorm move across the Judean hills in 400 BCE. Lightning strikes every few minutes along the ridgeline, each bolt followed by rolling thunder that carries for seconds across the valley. Every person watching is reading that display. Not metaphorically, because in the cosmological framework of every major ancient Near Eastern civilization, lightning is not a weather event to endure until it passes. Lightning is communication from the domain of beings who inhabit the region above the terrestrial. A watcher angel named Baraqel taught humans the framework for receiving it. The oldest written record of that teaching is sealed inside the caves at Qumran as of 68 CE, where it remains until 1947. Baraqel appears in 1 Enoch chapter 6 verse 7 as the sixth named leader among Samyaza's 20 commanders. His name is built from 2 roots: Barak, meaning lightning in Hebrew and Aramaic, and El, meaning God, lightning of God. In the naming conventions of the Watcher hierarchy, a being's name describes their function. Baraqel's function was the reading of lightning and atmospheric phenomena as a divine signal system, a formalized framework by which celestial communications could be received and interpreted without institutional intermediary. This practice has a formal name. Caranoscopy is the Greek term for the organized observation and interpretation of lightning and thunder as prophetic signals. It was conducted in Mesopotamia, where Babylonian scholars maintained organized records correlating lightning events with historical outcomes across centuries. The haruspices of ancient Rome constituted a state priesthood whose official function included caranoscopy, reading atmospheric phenomena as divine communication on behalf of the Roman state. Ancient Greek tradition positioned Zeus's lightning bolt not as a metaphor for power, but as a literal communication mechanism that trained interpreters could decode. The same practice appears in Canaanite, Anatolian, and Persian traditions, each describing it as inherited rather than invented. That pattern cross-cultural appearance without documented contact at the earliest points of practice is the same signature seen throughout the Watcher teaching tradition. In the textual tradition that names the function and its teacher, that source is Baraqel. Augustine of Hippo addressed this tradition directly in The City of God, written between 413 and 426 CE. He did not declare lightning trivially meaningless. He argued against it at philosophical length, seriously, over multiple chapters, because the tradition posed a real enough threat to require sustained refutation. Augustine argued against Baraqel's legacy without being able to name Baraqel, because the text naming Baraqel had been excluded from the canonical record he was working within. You do not write sustained philosophical refutation of something that poses no threat to your institution. The canonical texts preserve the concept of divine communication while eliminating the unmediated channel that Baraqel represents. Divine communication in the canonical framework arrives through prophets, but the Church determines which prophets are canonical. Through Scripture, but the Church determines what is Scripture. Through sacraments, but the Church administers them. Every channel in the canonical framework requires institutional mediation at some stage. Someone with authority to identify authorized voices, authentic texts, valid sacraments. Lightning communicates directly. It requires no priest, no canon, no institutional authorization. It arrives in every storm over every population on Earth, and Baraqel taught humans a framework for receiving it without anyone's permission. An unmediated, universally accessible, institutionally uncontrollable channel of divine communication is precisely what an institution, built on controlling divine communication channels, cannot allow to remain in the record. The Ugaritic texts from ancient Canaan, excavated at Ras Shamra in Syria, beginning in 1929, describe the deity Baal as rider of the clouds, sending lightning as a functional communication mechanism, not a metaphor for power, but a described operational channel. The Ugaritic tradition predates the Israelite period and overlaps geographically with the region where the Watcher tradition developed. Researcher Mark Smith of Princeton Theological Seminary, in The Origins of Biblical Monotheism, published in 2001, documented the deep connections between Ugaritic celestial theology and the Hebrew biblical tradition that followed it. The lightning communication framework was not imported into the ancient Near East from outside. It was already there, documented before any of the canonical traditions that later suppressed it existed. What is the specific interpretive framework Baraqel transmitted, and in which surviving texts has it been partially preserved under other names? Why did Augustine of Hippo write sustained philosophical argumentation against a celestial sign tradition in a work published 4 centuries after the council that excluded the text naming that tradition's angelic teacher? And what would the Church have lost if Baraqel's teaching remained giving every human population the means to read divine communication in every storm without needing institutional authorization? The storms arrive. The lightning still strikes. Someone is still reading it. Baraqel worked with the sky above. Turiel worked with what's beneath. His teaching was about the earth itself and what the earth records that human memory cannot hold. Number 9. Turiel. You're in the Judean desert in 150 BCE. 3 miles from the cliff edge above the Dead Sea. Someone is reading the rock formations around a dry wadi bed. Not for water, not for mineral deposits. For information about approaching conditions patterns forming in the physical world that the Earth's structure carries as legible record. The observational framework they are using traces its transmission lineage to a watcher angel named Turiel. 20 miles northwest, in the cave libraries of Qumran, scholars are copying the text that names him. Both the practice and the text will be buried within 2 centuries. The practice criminalized first by a church council in 305 CE. The text buried second by a different church council in 363 CE. 58 years between the ban and the burial. That gap is not a coincidence. That gap is a strategy. Turiel is listed in 1 Enoch chapter 6 verse 7 as one of Samyaza's 20 named commanders. His name is built from the Semitic root tur, meaning mountain or rock, combined with El, meaning God, mountain of God, rock of God. He is the only angel in the Watcher hierarchy whose name identifies him directly with the earth, not the sky, not the celestial intermediate realm, not stars or lightning, the solid ground under human feet. His teaching follows from his identification. Geomancy, the reading of the earth's physical formations as an information system encoding patterns relevant to human events. Geomancy appears across multiple ancient civilizations, with no documented contact at the earliest points of practice. The Arabian tradition of Ilm al-Ramel, the science of the sand, traces consistently to pre-Islamic Semitic sources. Medieval European geomantic textbooks, including the Ars Geomantia, circulated in the 13th and 14th centuries, claim transmission from Arabic to Aramaic and Hebrew sources. That chain, followed backward through the scholarly record, terminates in the Semitic world of the Second Temple period, the same context where the Book of Enoch was written. the same world where Turiel's name was recorded. The Council of Elvira, convened in 305 CE in what is now Granada, Spain, produced Canon 6, prohibiting the practice of mathematici, a term covering geomantic practitioners alongside astrologers. This is the earliest known formal church prohibition of geomantic practice. The Council of Laodicea in 363 CE excluded the Book of Enoch from the Western canon 58 years later. The church banned Turiel's teaching before it buried the text naming Turiel. Criminalize the practice first. Remove the textual evidence second. The prohibition stands in the canonical record without an origin story. The practice appears criminal without the context that would explain what it actually is. This sequencing mirrors the Kokabiel record. Criminalize the practice, establish the prohibition, then remove the text identifying the angelic source. Both suppressions used identical institutional mechanics. Both left the prohibition standing without the origin. The earth itself is a record. Geological formations carry timelines in millions of years. Rock strata document climate cycles, catastrophic events, and environmental shifts across timescales no human generation could accumulate. The framework Turiel transmitted reading Earth formations as a system carrying information about approaching conditions describes the original human access point to the Earth's own record-keeping. What modern geology calls strata, what seismology identifies as precursor signals, what surface hydrology reveals through topographic analysis. Different vocabulary sets for the same fundamental activity, reading what the Earth has recorded in its physical structure. Turiel's teaching names the source of that activity. What the Church removed with Turiel is identical to what it removed with Baraqel's lightning and Kokabiel's stars. A direct, unmediated, institutionally uncontrollable source of information accessible to any person who learns to read it. Ground beneath your feet, sky above, stars at night, all three encode information. All three were transmitted by specific named watcher angels. All three were targeted by the same sequenced suppression strategy. Criminalize first, bury the text second. Maintain the prohibition continuously. Researcher Joanna Ronca's analysis of Arabic geomantic traditions established their traceable lineage to pre-Islamic Semitic sources, the same cultural context that preserved the Enochic tradition these councils worked to suppress. Why did the Council of Elvira ban geomantic practice 58 years before the Council of Laodicea excluded the text naming geomancy's angelic teacher? What specific information does the Earth's physical formation system carry that required this level of sustained institutional response? And what would humans be reading in the landscape around them, the rock faces, the dry riverbeds, the soil formations, if Turiel's teaching had remained in the accessible record? The text was sealed at Qumran. The practice was criminalized at Elvira. Both were buried. Turiel knew what was in the earth. Remiel knew what was in the dark between death and what comes after. He is the last angel on this list, and he is the one the Church had the most urgent reason to erase. Number 10. Remiel. You're at the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 CE in Nicaea, in what is now Western Turkey. The council's primary business is the iconoclasm controversy whether veneration of icons constitutes idolatry. They will resolve it. What they will not resolve at this council, or any council in the entire history of Western Christianity, is what happens to human souls in the period between physical death and the final resurrection. 4 centuries of theological debate. No consensus. The space between death and judgment will remain officially undefined in Western doctrine until the Council of Florence in 1439 CE formally produces the doctrine of purgatory. And the financial apparatus built on that doctrine will trigger the Protestant Reformation 78 years later. That space was not left undefined in the original textual tradition. A named angel holds it. He was divinely appointed to hold it before the institution that later monetized it existed. 1 Enoch chapter 20 verse 8. Remiel, one of the holy angels, whom God set over those who rise. Set over those who rise. Administrative language. Appointment to a designated jurisdiction. Remiel does not escort individual souls through death. He administers the intermediate state, the space between physical death and the final resurrection described in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 16 and Revelation chapter 20, verses 12 through 13. He manages the population of souls awaiting judgment. That space is his jurisdiction. His appointment predates by centuries the institution that later claimed authority over it. The second book of Baruch, the Syriac apocalypse of Baruch, dated to approximately 100 CE and preserved in Syriac manuscript tradition outside the Western canon, names Remiel at chapter 55, verse 3. The fourth book of Baruch contains Remiel material in the explicit context of resurrection and the intermediate state. These are specific texts with specific dates in manuscript traditions that predate the Church's canon formation. They name the administrator of the space the Church later monetized. He was named there first. The medieval Church's economy of purgatory is one of the most financially consequential theological constructs in Western history. Formally defined at the Council of Florence in 1439 CE, the doctrine holds that souls undergoing purification after death can be assisted by the prayers and masses of the living services the Church provides for a fee. The indulgence system funded St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Pope Leo X issued the indulgence package in 1514 CE that Martin Luther responded to with his 95 Thesis in 1517 CE, initiating the Protestant Reformation and fracturing Western Christianity permanently. Luther attacked the indulgence economy from within the canonical framework. He never named Remiel. He argued the Church lacked scriptural authority to sell access to the afterlife without knowing that space already had a divinely appointed administrator whose prior appointment the institution could not revoke. The Reformation was accidentally correct for a reason neither side knew, because both sides worked within a canon from which the relevant evidence had been deliberately removed. The Protestant tradition rejected purgatory entirely, arguing it has no basis in canonical scripture. Correct in the canonical scripture. In the excluded texts, the intermediate state has a named administrator with a prior divine appointment. Both sides of the Reformation debate were working within a deliberately incomplete record. Remiel's name survives in the oldest continuous Christian traditions. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church lists him among the 7 archangels in its liturgical practice. The Coptic Orthodox Church preserves variant forms of this name in its archangel tradition. Both institutions predate the Western canonical councils. Both kept the record. What the councils removed from the West has been maimed in those liturgies every week for 1600 years. These 10 angels are not peripheral figures in obscure texts. Azazel is buried under rocks in a named desert until Judgment Day, while his name sits unmoved in Leviticus. Gadriel deceived Eve, and the Church built a replacement theology to cover his absence. Samyaza commanded a named sworn descent whose oath location has an inscription in the British Museum. Penemue introduced writing, and the institution built on writing removed his record. Kokabiel's teaching was banned and buried in the same room in the same year. Armaros gave humans independent protective capability, and the Church removed it while preserving the battle. Saraqael administers a celestial court the Church collapsed to a single throne it could claim to control. Baraqel taught unmediated divine communication in every storm, and the Church spent 12 centuries eliminating the channel. Turiel's practice was criminalized 58 years before the text naming him was buried. And Remiel administers the space between death and resurrection that the Church turned into its most profitable theological product. 10 specific functions, 10 documented removals, 1 institution, 1 pattern. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Like if you think the canonical Bible was edited with a purpose. And drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from.